In 1964, Burns guitars were played by Hank Marvin and the Shadows, endorsed on Kellogg's cereal boxes across Britain, and hand-built by craftsmen in a Romford workshop where every instrument was touched by 12 pairs of hands. The pickups they wound, 5,000 turns of copper wire, one coil at a time, would define the sound of Queen for the next 30 years. Then the company was sold. An American piano manufacturer paid £250,000, 1/34 of what CBS had paid for Fender, stripped the hand-carved headstocks down to flat stampings, shipped guitars to Arkansas, where the finishes cracked apart in the humidity, and abandoned the brand the moment they acquired Gretsch. The piano company itself went bankrupt in 1983 with $9 billion in debt. Today, Chesham Close in Romford has no plaque. A no marker nobody remembers. This is the story of Jim Burns, a self-taught craftsman from County Durham who built Britain's answer to Fender from a series of small workshops and lost everything to a buyer that understood pianos, not guitars. Not through one failure. Through 6 decisions, each one reasonable, each one removing something that could never be replaced. Chapter 1. The Man Who Sketched on Cigarette Packets. The story begins in 1925, in the northeast of England, Washington, County Durham, a few miles south of Newcastle upon Tyne. Coal country, shipyard country, a place where men worked with their hands because that's what there was to do. James Ormston Burns was born into this. Working class in a region defined by heavy industry and the particular grit it demanded. Nothing about his early years suggested he'd one day build Britain's answer to Fender. But then, nothing about Leo Fender's early years suggested he'd build Fender either. The difference is that Fender got to keep what he made. At 18, Burns joined the Royal Air Force. Not as a pilot, as a metal worker and fitter. It was 1943, the middle of the Second World War, and the RAF needed people who could make things, mend things, keep machines running. Burns was stationed in Africa, and it was there in 1944, using nothing but RAF materials and whatever ingenuity a teenager from County Durham could muster, that he built his first electric guitar. Cannibalised parts, military scrap, sheer bloody-mindedness. The man who would become Britain's greatest guitar maker learned his trade in a wartime workshop on another continent, and thousands of miles from home. After demobilisation in 1946, Burns worked as a joiner, a cabinet maker, a woodworker. So now he had both skills. Metalwork from the RAF, woodwork from civilian trade. He also worked as a professional Hawaiian steel guitar player, a guitar teacher, a waiter, a paint sprayer. He was, as one magazine later put it, a perfect storm of skills for a budding guitar maker. Though nobody, least of all Jim Burns, knew that yet. He was also a nocturnal creature. Slept all day, worked late into the night, appeared at the workshop around 3 in the afternoon for a chat and to see how things were progressing, often boasting about his nightclub tan, that pale complexion of a man who rarely saw daylight. His workers, of course, had been grafting since morning. His design method was legendary and maddening in equal measure. Burns would sketch new guitar designs on scraps of paper, pieces of wood, or the backs of cigarette packets, then hand them to whoever had to make the thing real. The gap between the scrawl and the finished instrument was bridged by patience, skill, and the quiet professionalism of craftsmen who learned to interpret his shorthand. More of this and less of that, he'd say, sometimes gluing pieces back onto a body he'd just asked them to carve away. It took days of trial and error. But it worked. His collaborators remembered him as not particularly technically minded, but as a man of great ideas. Paul Day, who wrote the first comprehensive book on Burns guitars, called him an eccentric and quite complex individual, chock full of hope and brimming with ideas one day, moody, or morose and miserable the next. Barry Gibson, who would later try to revive the brand, saw a complex man who concealed a volatile and depressive temperament behind a cheerful, extrovert mask. And there was the drinking. Norman Holder, his machine shop foreman, recalled it with the careful understatement of a man who'd seen plenty. A fair bit of drinking. Jim's favourite pastime. Suppliers had bounced checks from Jim Burns framed on their office walls, not as evidence, as souvenirs. Burns himself, in a rare moment of self-reflection in 1964, said simply, "I had a natural bent for using my hands. I was a trained woodworker, and working as a fitter gave me a chance of playing around with metal too. I had always been interested in trying to perfect a solid resonance-free instrument. That was the seed. But seeds need soil. And the soil, and as it happened, was a country that desperately needed what Jim Burns could make." Chapter 2. The country that had no guitars. After the Second World War, Britain was broke. Not struggling, broke. The country had amassed £21 billion in war debt. The American Lend-Lease loan of $3.75 billion would not be fully repaid until 2006. Food rationing didn't end until 1954, and the British Board of Trade controlled imports with an iron grip, catching musical instruments, including American guitars, in restrictions that lasted from the end of the war until June 1959. Even after the ban lifted, the prices were staggering. A Fender Stratocaster listed at £177.50 in 1961, when average weekly wages sat around £12 to £15. And that's roughly 3 months' salary for a working man, for a guitar. British musicians made do with what they could get. Höfner from Germany, Hagström from Sweden, Egmond from Holland, Futurama from Czechoslovakia. Solid-body electric guitars were virtually unknown and unseen. Britain, as one historian noted, had no fretted instrument industry to speak of. Then came skiffle. The craze peaked in 1956 and 57, led by Lonnie Donegan, and it did something no government policy or import restriction could prevent. It made hundreds of thousands of young Britons want to play guitar. The transition from skiffle to rock and roll from 1958 onwards turned that want into surging demand for electric instruments. American solid bodies were the gold standard but were almost completely unavailable and, when they did appear, prohibitively expensive. The gap was enormous. The conditions were ripe for a British manufacturer to fill it. Jim Burns had moved to London in 1952 and built his first Hawaiian guitar that year. But reaching the market required partnerships, and partnerships required trust, and trust required a stability that Jim Burns could never quite provide. The first attempt was Supersound in 1958. Burns partnered with Alan and Mary Wooten, who ran an amplifier company in Wilmington, near Dartford. The arrangement was simple. Supersound supplied materials, Burns made the bodies and necks. Together they produced the Ike Isaacs short-scale model, endorsed by the respected jazz guitarist of the same name, and what are now considered Britain's first commercial solid-body electric guitars and basses. The instruments were crude, pine bodies, mahogany set-in necks, a no-truss rod. But they were historic. The partnership lasted only months. By December 1958, Burns had been let go. The second attempt was Burns Weil in 1959. Burns handled the woodwork, Henry Weil the electronics. They produced the Super Streamline, a guitar that one historian nicknamed the Martian cricket bat, calling it one of the ugliest guitars you'll ever see, but nevertheless a surprisingly good player. This partnership lasted about a year before it too collapsed. Burns owed Weil money. A deal was struck. Henry would keep the designs, consider the debt paid, and Jim would walk away. Weil continued producing instruments under the Fenton Weil name, initially just cutting the Burns part off the nameplate. 2 partnerships, 2 failures, both ending with Burns walking away from his own designs. And a pattern was forming, brilliant creation followed by commercial self-destruction, and it would define his entire life. But the third attempt was different. In 1959, Burns founded Ormston Burns Limited. Ormston wasn't a business partner. It was Jim's own middle name. The company was co-founded with Alice Louise Farrell, who provided the financial discipline and operational leadership that Burns himself could never sustain. Her brother Peter handled production. They began making guitars in the cellar of Louise Farrell's house at 131 Queen's Road, Buckhurst Hill, Essex. Picture it. A terraced house in suburban Essex. A cellar, guitar bodies roughly cut at George Jackson's furniture factory in Harlow, then hand-shaped underground. This was Britain's guitar industry. This was the entire thing. In 1960, they acquired a proper workshop at Cherry Tree Rise near Roding Valley Tube Station. In 1961, they moved briefly to 300 Mace Street in Hackney, their first East London address. They were growing. And in December of that year, they produced something that announced to anyone paying attention that this wasn't a hobby operation any longer. Chapter 3. The Black Bison and the Sound That Changed Everything. The naming was accidental. Jim Burns showed a prototype to Ike Isaacs, the jazz guitarist who'd become his most trusted advisor on playability and design. The body had curved horns, a dramatic silhouette. Isaacs looked at it and said, "It looks like a bloody bison." Burns, who hadn't thought of a name, christened it exactly that. The Black Bison, introduced in December 1961, was an engineering marvel of staggering ambition. And only 49 were ever made. Number 50, according to legend, ended up as a coffee table. Each one featured 4 ultrasonic low-impedance pickups, and each of those pickups contained 6 individual bobbins, 1 coil per string. That's 24 coils across 4 pickups, with internal transformers to boost the output. A beautifully sculpted double cutaway body with forward-sloping horns, finished entirely in black polyester. A patented gearbox truss rod system, so clever that Gretsch later borrowed the design. Patented split sound switching, which picked up bass notes from the neck pickup and treble from the bridge simultaneously. A heel-less glued-in set neck with a 24-fret fingerboard, probably the first production guitar in the world to offer 24 frets. Gold-plated hardware. Van Gent tuners. A cigar tube tuner cover. The price was £157.50. A Fender Stratocaster cost £177.50. For £20 less, you got a guitar that, in terms of sheer engineering complexity, made the Stratocaster look restrained. Each Black Bison was essentially hand-built. Cottage industry conditions, extraordinary ambition, completely uneconomical to manufacture. The guitar was redesigned with 3 pickups in 1962 to become commercially viable. Of the original 49 4-pickup Bisons, only 15 to 19 are known to survive. They are among the most sought-after British guitars in existence, built in a basement and a small factory by a man who sketched the design on the back of a cigarette packet. But the Black Bison, magnificent as it was, wasn't the innovation that would echo through decades of recorded music. That distinction belongs to a pickup. The Trisonic was Burns' most famous design. Where conventional pickups emanated their magnetic field from one direction, the Trisonic projected it from 3 points, the top and both sides, interacting with a longer than usual length of string. Approximately 5,000 turns of 44 gauge enamelled copper wire around Alnico magnets. The result was a uniquely big, round sound, warm but with definition, powerful but not harsh. In 1963, a teenager from Feltham named Brian May walked into the Burns showroom at St Giles Circus in London and bought 3 Trisonic pickups for 9 guineas. He installed them in a guitar he was building with his father, a homemade instrument crafted from an old fireplace mantel. That guitar became the Red Special, and every Queen record ever made, every note of Bohemian Rhapsody, every harmonic layer of We Will Rock You, every solo Brian May ever recorded with that band, features the sound of Burns' Trisonic pickups. Meanwhile, the company was growing. The Bison's 3-pickup production version became the flagship, with its famous Wild Dog setting, an out-of-phase tone preset that produced a distinctive snarling, nasal sound unlike anything else on the market. The jazz split sound became the mid-price workhorse, outselling everything else in the range. Burns was innovating at a pace that kept him consistently ahead of American competitors. Active electronics on the TR2 in 1963, years before Fender or Gibson offered anything similar. Heel-less neck joints for better upper fret access. Polyester finishes pioneered by Derek Adams that gave the instruments a depth and luster that set them apart visually. And then came the endorsement that changed everything. Chapter 4. 22,000 square feet of handcraft. By 1963, Burns had outgrown every premises he'd occupied. The company moved to their final and most significant location, Brooklands Approach, published address Chesham Close, in Romford, Essex, 9 miles from the previous site. 22,500 square feet of floor space in a series of small industrial buildings just off North Street, near the bus depot. Tony Bacon, the guitar historian, described the setting with appropriate understatement. Chesham Close in Romford, Essex, does not look like a site of outstanding British rock and roll importance. Walk down the street today and you're unlikely to be impressed by the series of small, ordinary industrial buildings ranged along either side. He was right. It didn't look like much. But inside those ordinary walls, something extraordinary was being built. A guitar began its life at Burns as a rough-shaped body from a furniture manufacturer in Epping. Les Andrews, the chief cabinet maker, the man who'd been translating Jim Burns's cigarette packet sketches into reality since the earliest basement days, received these blanks and began the transformation. When Burns developed a new model, Andrews described the process. A blank piece of timber, cut roughly in the shape of the body, covered in Jim's pencil lines, notes and shading. Then days of carving, adjusting, gluing pieces back on until Jim was satisfied. It was sculpture as much as manufacturing. The wood itself told a story of post-war Britain. English sycamore was used instead of maple because maple was an import and it cost dollars, which was taboo in an economy still recovering from wartime debt. Norman Holder, the machine shop foreman who'd been brought in to mechanise production, called this a fool's choice, maple being the more stable timber. When they tried mahogany for guitars bound for America, it backfired badly. The mahogany instruments warped and degraded, earning Burns a poor reputation in the States, a wound that would never fully heal. Each guitar required 12 workers to complete. The process moved through the building like a river through a landscape, sawing and rough shaping in one area, hand finishing in another, neck fitting and fretting further along, then into pick-up winding and assembly. Those trisonics wound one at a time, 5,000 turns of copper wire around Alnico magnets. Wiring. Soldering. Then into Derek Adams's domain, the polyester finishing room, where the distinctive Burns luster was applied coat by coat. And finally, setup, the last adjustments before an instrument left the building. The sensory world of that factory was specific and unforgettable. The dry, sweet smell of sycamore dust as Les Andrews' team carved bodies to shape. The sharp chemical bite of polyester lacquer hanging in the finishing room. Not unpleasant exactly, but unmistakable, the kind of smell that gets into your clothes and follows you home. The quiet concentration of the pickup winding station, where precision mattered more than speed. The thin blue curl of solder smoke rising from the electronics bench. The resonant thunk of a neck joint being fitted, a sound you'd feel through the workbench as much as hear. And somewhere in the middle of it all, around 3 in the afternoon, Jim Burns would appear. Nightclub tan, cigarette in hand, sketching modifications on whatever surface presented itself, a scrap of paper, a piece of off-cut timber, the margin of a parts invoice. His workers had been at it since morning. Jim worked on a different clock. The central philosophy was what one commentator called mass-produced one-offs. High craftsmanship within a production setting, but no two guitars truly identical. The slimness of a neck depended on how the man doing that particular operation was feeling that particular day. This was the glory and the limitation of Burns. Every instrument had character, but character doesn't scale. Jack Golder managed the factory floor. His background was at Roots Motors, the car manufacturer, and colleagues recalled that he had plenty of rabbit and talked his way to managing the firm. Norman Holder ran the machine shop, Peter Farrell oversaw production, Gordon Chandler handled design work. Phil Storm, Phil Sweet was his real name, drew up the technical specifications. Derek Adams, quiet and meticulous, perfected the finishing process that gave Burns guitars their visual identity. Together, in the last full year before the sale, they produced approximately 2,480 guitars and 660 basses. Roughly 3,140 instruments. About 60 per week. Impressive for what was essentially a workshop operation. Modest compared to Fender's factory output across the Atlantic. But every single one was hand-finished in Romford, Essex, by people whose names we know. The crown jewel was the Marvin. Developed over 2 years with more than 30 prototypes, the Marvin was Burns's masterpiece. An offset double cutaway body with 3 Resomatic pickups, Stratocaster influenced, but distinctly Burns, mounted at a slant. The Reso tube vibrato system, which worked on an entirely different principle from Fender's synchronized tremolo. A long duralumin plate with a knife edge bearing, strings passing through individual tubes inside a body recess, completely isolated from the wood. The result was a vibrato that stayed in tune, the Rolls-Royce of vibratos, as one historian called it. The neck had a chunky, soft V profile near the nut, rounding to a full C in higher registers. Hand-shaped, with the slight irregularities that mark handwork rather than machine production. A deep carved scroll headstock engraved with the words, "Designed and handcrafted for Hank B. Marvin by Burns." White finish. Red tortoiseshell pick guard. 25.5-inch scale, matching Fender. Price £162.50. Fewer than 400 Marvins were ever produced. The pickups gave a sound described by specialists as stratty, but never thin, a sparkling brightness with body underneath it. Hold one now and you feel the difference immediately. The weight distribution is precise. The scroll headstock has depth, 3-dimensional, sculptural, clearly carved by hand rather than stamped from a template. And the vibrato arm has the satisfying mechanical resistance of a well-engineered system. This was not a guitar trying to be a Fender. This was a guitar that had looked at what Fender did and decided it could do better. The Double Six, introduced in 1964, was the 12-string companion, the longest headstock of any Burns model, fitted with the same Reso tube vibrato system. Considered one of the finest 12 strings ever made. The Virginian was a semi-acoustic with the signature scroll headstock, only about 70 produced. The new Sonic was the entry-level model, small and sculpted, and, as one reviewer noted, handy and frankly rather cute. About 350 guitars and 150 basses in its short life. And then there was the Jazz Split Sound, the workhorse, with 3 trisonic pickups with a rotary control giving 4-tone selections including Wild Dog and Split Sound. Short scale. It outsold everything else Burns made. The vast majority of Ampeg-branded Burns guitars sent to America were Jazz Split Sounds. Chapter 5. The moment everything aligned. The connection between Burns and the Shadows was made by Ike Isaacs. Isaacs was a renowned jazz guitarist who served as Burns' technical director and playability consultant, and he happened to be the former guitar teacher of Hank Marvin. Towards the end of 1963, both Hank Marvin and rhythm guitarist Bruce Welch had grown frustrated with tuning problems on their white Fender Stratocasters. Welch was so obsessed with tuning stability that he briefly announced he was leaving the band over it. Isaacs arranged a meeting between Jim Burns and Hank Marvin. Hank wanted a guitar that remained perfectly in tune, even with heavy vibrato use, and offered more tonal variation than the Stratocaster could provide. Burns built over 30 prototypes across roughly 24 months. Hank wrote, with a patience that borders on saintly, "Those fellows up at Romford must have loved me. Over 30 models were completed before the final job appeared. I just had to keep sending them back, because if I didn't find something wrong, a certain rhythm guitarist would." When the Shadows first appeared with their new Burns guitars in early 1964, the shock was felt in every guitar enclave in Britain. The Shadows were the most influential musical act in the country. Their trademark sound with Fender guitars and Vox amplifiers was the apex of desire for thousands of aspiring guitarists. The switch to Burns was comparable to what the Ventures did in America by switching from Fender to Mosrite, But even that West Coast combo never had the concentrated influence of the Shadows. The effect was immediate and electric. Burns guitars were suddenly everywhere that mattered. Elvis Presley used a Burns double 6 12-string in the films Spin Out and Easy Come, Easy Go. That guitar now sits on permanent display at Graceland, 4,000 miles from the Romford factory where it was made. George Harrison used a Burns New Sonic bass during the Revolver sessions in 1966, on tracks including Rain. John Lennon had his Rickenbacker refinished by Burns and collaborated with Jim on an unrealized guitar organ project. Jimmy Page played Burns. Eric Clapton played Burns. Mark Bolan, Jeff Lynne, Mark Knopfler, Status Quo, The Troggs, The Searchers, Burt Whedon, Tom Petty, Willie Nelson, Beck. And in 1964, Kellogg's Rice Krispies ran a promotion across Britain. 70 Burns electric guitars to be won. Advertised on cereal boxes, in households from Romford to Inverness. Burns guitars had penetrated mainstream consumer culture. A guitar maker who'd started in a basement in Buckhurst Hill was now on the nation's breakfast tables. That same year, Burns was exporting to America through a partnership with Ampeg, each instrument bearing an Ampeg by Burns of London pickguard logo. Beat Instrumental magazine would later claim that nearly all models of Burns guitars were practically out of stock because of the vast amount of exporting to the States, though this was likely just PR fluff. Around 100 instruments had actually been shipped. But here is the detail that reframes everything. In 1964, at the absolute peak of Burns' success, the Shadows endorsement, the Kellogg's promotion, the export deals, the celebrity players, the 22,000 square feet of productive workshop space, the company was virtually bankrupt. Jim Burns had invested heavily in pioneering transistor amplifiers, clean-sounding, solid-state amps that represented the future of amplification technology. There was just one problem. Musicians hated them. They wanted the warmth and natural overdrive of valve amplifiers, and they rejected Burns transistor amps comprehensively. The venture drained capital the company didn't have. Jack Golder, the factory manager, was consistently over-ordering parts, enthusiasm outrunning arithmetic, hurting cash flow with every surplus delivery. Eddie Cross, and the supplier whose firm made Burns plastic parts and hardware, had a bounced check from Jim Burns framed on his office wall. Not as an accusation, as a kind of monument. The guitars that were appearing on television screens and cereal boxes were being produced by a company that couldn't reliably pay its bills. The Shadows endorsement masked the truth. The Kellogg's promotion papered over the cracks. Beat instrumental profiles spoke of triumph while the account books spoke of insolvency. And by 1965, Ormston Burns Limited, Britain's greatest guitar maker, builder of the Bison, the Marvin, the instruments played by Hank Marvin and Brian May and George Harrison, was deeply in debt and in desperate need of rescue. Help arrived from Cincinnati, Ohio. It arrived in the form of a piano company, and it would destroy everything Jim Burns had built. Chapter 6. The Piano Company's Consolation Prize. The D.H. Baldwin Piano and Organ Company was founded in Cincinnati, Ohio in 1862 by Dwight Hamilton Baldwin. A family dynasty. Conservative, old-money Midwestern corporate culture built on prestige keyboard instruments, grand pianos and church organs. The Woolson family had controlled it for generations. Lucien Woolson III became president in 1961. Baldwin wanted into the guitar market. The electric guitar boom of the early 1960s was making fortunes, and Baldwin saw an opportunity to expand beyond keyboards. They set their sights on the biggest prize available, Fender. Leo Fender was having health problems and had put his company up for sale. Woolson authorized a bid. CBS outbid them. $13 million. Fender, the company Jim Burns had been competing against, learning from, trying to surpass, went to a broadcasting corporation for a sum that dwarfed anything Baldwin could match. Scrambling for an alternative, Baldwin turned to Burns. Richard Harrison, Baldwin's treasurer, was dispatched to London to negotiate what was initially discussed as a distribution deal, American sales for British guitars. But Harrison found the company in such dire financial straits that the conversation shifted. He later recalled that Jim Burns was pleasant enough, but that he spent most of the next several weeks in talks with Burns's attorney trying to sort out the terrible state of affairs at the guitar maker. The distribution deal became an acquisition. There was nothing else it could become. Paperwork was signed on the 30th of September 1965. The price, £250,000. Approximately $380,000. 1/34 of what CBS had paid for Fender. The purchase agreement was signed by 3 of 5 Burns directors, Jim Burns, James Farrell, and Ike Isaacs. The UK entity was renamed Baldwin Burns Limited. Most of the purchase price went straight to paying off debts owed to suppliers and creditors. Jim Burns was prohibited from ever using the Burns brand name again. For Burns, it was sell or go bankrupt. For Baldwin, it was a consolation prize, the guitar company they bought because they couldn't afford the guitar company they wanted. And now a piano manufacturer from Ohio owned Britain's finest guitar maker. The people who built church organs and concert grands were responsible for the Bison, the Marvin, the trisonic pickup, at the Resotube vibrato. Not one person Baldwin placed in charge of the Burns operation had any experience with electric guitars. Not one. Jim Burns stayed on as a consultant for approximately a year. New product development ground to a halt as Baldwin adjusted to the shock of inheriting a product line targeted at an entirely new market. Burns left in 1966. The man who'd sketched guitars on cigarette packets, who'd built his first instrument from RAF scrap in wartime Africa, who'd created the pickups that would define the sound of Queen, walked away from the company bearing his name, prohibited from using that name with whatever consulting fee Baldwin had paid him. The craftsman at Romford kept working. For the moment. Chapter 7. 6 decisions that killed a guitar. What happened next was not a single catastrophe. It was a sequence of decisions, each one reasonable in isolation, each one devastating in combination. Baldwin didn't set out to destroy Burns. They set out to make it profitable. The destruction was a side effect. The first decision was the distribution strategy. Baldwin had an existing national retail network across America, piano and organ dealerships in towns and cities from coast to coast. Rather than build a guitar distribution channel from scratch, they attempted to sell British electric guitars through these shops. Shops that, as one analyst noted, attracted a far different clientele. Piano store customers didn't want electric guitars. Guitar store customers didn't know Baldwin sold guitars. A teenager looking for something to play Satisfaction on was not browsing the same showroom as a church organist selecting a Hammond. And the channel was fundamentally, irreparably wrong. Someone summarised the situation with brutal precision. Baldwin had bought at the wrong time the wrong guitar range and wanted to sell them with the wrong people. The second decision was the rationalisation of design. Beginning in mid-1966, Baldwin systematically stripped away the features that made Burns guitars distinctive. Start with the headstock. The carved scroll headstock, hand-sculpted, three-dimensional, the visual signature of Burns excellence, was replaced with a cheap, flat, stamped version. Jack Golder, the factory manager who'd stayed on after Jim Burns left, designed the simplified scroll neck. It saved manufacturing time. It also removed the single most recognisable element of a Burns guitar's identity. Necks were standardised across all models. Where Burns had fitted different headstocks to different guitars, each model with its own character, its own visual identity, Baldwin gave every instrument the same neck. The distinctive triple dot octave markers on the fingerboard, one large centre dot flanked by 2 smaller ones, were replaced with 3 same-sized dots. The ultrasonic pickups were swapped for new bar magnet units. Controls were repositioned from edge-mounted thumb wheels to top-mounted knobs. Laminated pickguards gave way to see-through plastic. The new Sonic, that handy, cute entry-level guitar, was among the first models dropped. Discontinued in the autumn of 1966. The Vibra Slim underwent what was euphemistically called a major makeover. Renamed Model 548. It lost its internal wood construction, became fully hollow, and in the process lost what had made it unique and lovable. Each change was defensible on a spreadsheet. Together, they amounted to an autopsy performed on a living patient. The third decision was catastrophic in ways nobody at Baldwin anticipated. To avoid import tariffs on completed instruments, Baldwin had the Romford factory bring guitars to a semi-finished state, bodies in one shipping container, necks in another, and sent them to Fayetteville, Arkansas, for final assembly. Fayetteville was where Baldwin's electronic organ factory operated. It made sense on paper. Ship the parts, assemble them in America, save on tariffs. Burns had always used a distinctive polyester finish, pioneered by Derek Adams. Not polyurethane, polyester. It worked beautifully in England's temperate climate. It could not survive Arkansas. Steve Kruger, who managed Baldwin's Arkansas facilities, recalled the problem with the weary precision of a man who'd watched it happen in real time. Burns was using a polyester finish, not polyurethane. That worked fine for England, but when it got here, it couldn't handle the climate change. Duke Kramer was more blunt. The polyester finishes exploded. Guitars that had left Romford in pristine condition arrived in the American South and cracked, peeled, shattered. The humidity and temperature swings of Arkansas were lethal to a finish designed for Essex. Baldwin eventually hired a single employee whose entire job was refinishing damaged guitars. He never caught up. Brand new instruments made by skilled craftsmen in Romford arrived at dealers with ruined surfaces. The reputation that Burns had spent years building, the quality, the craftsmanship, the hand-finished feel was being destroyed in a warehouse in Fayetteville, one cracked finish at a time. The fourth decision was perhaps inevitable, but it sealed Burns's fate absolutely. In May 1967, Baldwin acquired the Fred Gretsch Company. Gretsch was American. Gretsch had established US distribution. Gretsch made guitars that American dealers understood, that American musicians recognized, that fitted into the existing market without explanation or apology. This was, as one insider put it, the sort of guitar operation Baldwin really wanted. Burns had always been the consolation prize. Now Baldwin had what they'd actually been looking for, an American guitar brand with American credibility. Burns became expendable overnight. Insiders recalled Baldwin demanding that the Gretsch sales force get rid of Baldwin guitars before they could start selling their own Gretsch product. The message was unmistakable. Burns was no longer a priority. Burns was an obstacle to be cleared. The fifth decision was the budget range. In 1967, Baldwin introduced the 700 series, guitars with Italian-made bodies fitted with Burns necks, aimed at the lower end of the market. They had, as one historian judged, hardly any Burns bloodline. These were guitars with the Burns name attached to instruments that bore no meaningful connection to the engineering, the craftsmanship, or the design philosophy that had made Burns guitars worth buying in the first place. The name was becoming a label on someone else's product. The sixth and final decision was the simplest. Baldwin stopped. By 1968, the guitar market was in a slump. Baldwin ceased shipments of the Italian-made 700 series. Production at Romford wound down. Few guitars have surfaced with dates past 1967. When Baldwin stopped, they simply piled all the machinery, stock, and anything else into a corner and pressed on with their other work. By 1970, Baldwin Burns guitar production had ceased entirely. Leftover guitars were sold off. Surplus stock cleared. The Romford factory reverted to generic industrial use. The 22,500 square feet where Les Andrews had carved bodies from sycamore blanks and Derek Adams had applied polyester finishes coat by coat. Where Norman Holder's machines had hummed and Jim Burns had appeared mid-afternoon with his cigarette packet sketches, fell silent. Chapter 8. What the decline felt like in your hands. The numbers tell one story. The instruments tell another. Pick up an original 1964 Burns Marvin, if you can find one, and if the owner will let you touch it, and the first thing you notice is the headstock. Deep, sculpted, three-dimensional. You can feel the tool marks where Les Andrews or one of his team shaped it by hand. Run your thumb along the edge and the slight irregularities are there, Not flaws, but evidence. Evidence that a human being carved this from wood, guided by pencil lines on a blank that Jim Burns had covered in notes and shading. The body is contoured, beautifully balanced, whether you're seated or standing. The Reso tube vibrato has that precision mechanical feel, knife-edge bearings, individually tubed strings, and the satisfying resistance of a system engineered to solve a specific problem. Keeping a guitar in tune when you bend the pitch. Hank Marvin's problem. The problem that 30 prototypes were built to solve. The Resomatic pickups produce that sparkling brightness. Stratty, but never thin. The neck has a chunky soft V profile, hand-shaped, with the character that only handwork gives. Now pick up a late Baldwin-era instrument. The headstock is flat, stamped. The three-dimensional sculptural quality is gone. It's recognisably a scroll shape, but it's a photograph of a scroll rather than the thing itself. The standardised neck lacks model-specific character. The polyester finish, if it's survived the decades, may show heavy checking, the thick overcoat practically peeling off in spots. Typical Baldwin-era condition, and as collectors describe it with a grimace. Late examples substituted bar-o-matic pickups for the original Resomatics. The tonal character shifted. The Vibra Slim, once that unique semi-solid design with its internal wood construction, had become a generic hollow body. Some collectors argue, fairly, that early Baldwin transition instruments maintained pre-Baldwin quality. Guitars from autumn 1965 through early 1966 were essentially Burns-built instruments with Baldwin branding, produced by the same hands using the same methods. This is broadly correct. The real decline began mid-1966 with the headstock simplification, the neck standardization, the component substitutions. By 1967, the budget Italian-bodied 700 series had, as one assessment put it, hardly any Burns bloodline at all. The gap between the 1964 Marvin and a late 1967 Baldwin Burns instrument is not subtle. It is the difference between a hand-tailored suit and one assembled from pre-cut pieces in a different country. Both are recognisably suits. But one fits the person it was made for. The other fits a pattern. Meanwhile, the craftsmen were leaving. Jack Golder and Norman Holder, the factory manager and the machine shop foreman, two men who'd been central to Burns' production since the early days, left in 1967 to co-found Shergold Woodcrafts, registered on the 25th of October that year. They took with them jigs, templates and surplus materials, the physical DNA of Burns guitar making. Derek Adams, who'd pioneered the polyester finish, went to work on the Heyman range for Dallas Arbiter alongside Golder and Holder. Eddie Cross, whose firm Edward Cross & Son had supplied Burns' plastic parts and hardware, faced severe financial difficulties when Baldwin ceased orders. His company had been heavily dependent on Burns. The cessation of those orders, as one associate recalled, gave Eddie's dad very serious problems. The bounced cheque from Jim Burns still hung on the office wall. Now the wall belonged to a business fighting for survival. The only piece of Burns technology that transferred to Gretsch, the only fragment of Jim Burns engineering that Baldwin carried from one acquisition to the other, was the gearbox truss rod adjustment system. One mechanism. Out of all those innovations, the trisonic pickup, the Reso tube vibrato, the split sound switching, the 24-fret neck, the active electronics, one truss rod design was all that survived the transition. Chapter 9. The man who could design anything and sell nothing. Jim Burns spent the rest of his life starting companies that failed. First came Ormston from 1966 to 68, marketing pedal steel guitars produced by Denley using his middle name because Baldwin owned Burns. Then Heyman Guitars from 1969 to 71, designing for Ivor Arbeiter's Dallas Arbiter Company alongside former Vox designer Bob Pearson. Burns departed in the autumn of 1971. His alcohol problems were worsening. His marriage to Frida ended during this period. Then Burns UK Limited from 1974 to 77, a partnership with Alan Wright of City Music Stores in Newcastle. They produced the Flight, an angular, Concorde-inspired design that attracted Mark Bolan and Dave Hill of Slade. Bodies and necks manufactured by Shergold, Golder and Holders Company, the firm built by former Burns craftsmen using Burns templates. The circle was tight and small. Burns UK ceased trading in 1977. Then Jim Burns Actualizers Limited from 1979 to 83, based in Littleport near Ely. The Steer, played by Billy Bragg. The Scorpion, a custom variant for Chris Stein of Blondie. The first attempt to recreate the Bison and Marvin in updated form. Ceased operations in 1983. 4 companies in 17 years. Each one a fresh start. Each one ending the same way. The pattern established in 1958 with Supersound, brilliant creation followed by commercial collapse, repeated itself with the mechanical inevitability of a design flaw in a machine that nobody could fix. Because the flaw was in the designer. In the early 1990s, A. Barry Gibson, a guitarist and Burns historian, tracked Jim down in Chatham. Gibson proposed reviving the brand one more time. Burns, by then in his late 60s, said, "Produce some prototypes first and then show them to me." After seeing the second prototype, Burns said, "If they're going to be this quality, you have my blessing." He served as freelance consultant for Burns London Limited until his death in 1998. He was approximately 73 years old. No detailed obituary has been found in public sources. The man who built Britain's answer to Fender, whose pickups defined the sound of one of the greatest rock bands in history, whose guitars were played by Elvis Presley and George Harrison and Hank Marvin, left the world as quietly as he'd arrived. A. Ron Wood's tribute captured the era with the simplicity it deserved. Before Fenders or Gibsons, we had something called a Burns. The Revival Company had its moments. In 1999, a Korean-manufactured club series received remarkable reviews. In 2001, a Burns and Brian May collaboration produced a red special replica that won Best Electric Guitar of the Year from Guitarist magazine. Roughly 4,660 were produced. In 2004, a limited reissue Marvin was promoted on the Shadows' final tour, with certificates signed by Hank Marvin himself. Hank said, "Some guitarists think America is the only source of high-quality electric guitars, but some remember the wonderful guitars designed and produced by Burns Guitar UK. In June 2020, a new consortium acquired the brand, Simon Gilson and Terry Hope of PMT, a Lee and Peter Anderton of Anderton's Music, Graham Bell of Guitar, and Christopher McBay." Gilson declared, "There is only one true historic guitar brand from England, and that's Burns." As of today, no new guitar production has been confirmed. The Burns London trademark expired in March 2024. A new application was filed in May 2025. The brand is, in the most generous interpretation, dormant. In the least generous, it is a name attached to nothing. And Baldwin, the piano company that bought Burns as a consolation prize, stripped it down, shipped it to Arkansas, watched the finishes explode, acquired Gretsch to replace it, and piled the machinery in a corner when they were done. Baldwin repeated the entire pattern with Gretsch. They moved production to Arkansas. Quality degraded. 2 factory fires in Boonville in 1973 devastated what remained. Baldwin ceased Gretsch guitar production entirely in 1981. Fred Gretsch III eventually bought his family's name back in January 1985. But Baldwin's destruction extended far beyond guitars. Under CEO Morley Thompson, Baldwin diversified aggressively into financial services from the 1970s onwards, acquiring savings and loan institutions, insurance companies, investment firms. Over 200 of them. By 1982, pianos represented just 3% of the company's $3.6 billion in revenue. Their flagship product was single premium deferred annuities, 165,000 policies worth over $4 billion. In late 1983, Baldwin United declared bankruptcy, $9 billion in debt. At that time, the largest bankruptcy in American history. And then, the final irony, the one that reads like fiction but isn't. In 2001, the the remnant Baldwin Piano Company filed for bankruptcy a second time and was acquired by Gibson Guitar Corporation, a guitar company. The piano company that had tried to become a guitar company by buying Burns was eventually consumed by a guitar company. Gibson moved Baldwin piano production to China. In December 2008, Baldwin ceased all domestic production. Chapter 10. The Silence at Chesham Close. Chesham Close, Brooklands Approach, Romford, Essex. RM77PJ. Today it is a nondescript business centre with multiple small industrial units. Property listings describe an established business centre located to the north of Romford town centre. There is no plaque, no memorial, no historical marker of any kind. Or one forum member, a guitarist who'd read the histories and wanted to see where the instruments were made, attempted to locate and photograph the building. The response from neighbours was blank incomprehension. A guitar factory? Here? Nobody remembered. Nobody knew. The earlier Burns locations have fared no better. Queen's Road in Buckhurst Hill, where Louise Farrell's cellar served as the birthplace of Britain's guitar industry. Cherry Tree Rise near Roding Valley, the first proper workshop. 300 Mace Street in Hackney, the first East London address. All returned to anonymous use, all unmarked, all forgotten by the streets around them. The only physical trace of Burns' legacy sitting in a public place is Elvis Presley's double 612 string in a glass case at Graceland, 4,000 miles from where it was made. As Chapter 11. What Remains. Burns' guitars were not the best electric guitars ever made. They were not better than the finest Fenders or Gibsons, not across the board, not consistently, not at every price point. What they were was something rarer. They were proof that Britain could do it, that a self-taught craftsman from County Durham, working with sycamore because maple cost dollars, sketching designs on cigarette packets in the middle of the night, could produce instruments of extraordinary engineering ambition and genuine musical quality. Instruments that Hank Marvin chose over his Stratocasters, that Elvis played on film, that Brian May made the foundation of a sound heard by billions. The tragedy is not that Burns' guitars disappeared. Guitar companies come and go. The tragedy is the pattern. And Britain has repeated this story so many times it ought to be tattooed on the national consciousness. The brilliant designer who can build anything and manage nothing. The foreign buyer who acquires what they don't understand. The slow, methodical dismantling of everything that made the thing worth buying. Rover, MG, Triumph, BSA, Norton, de Havilland, and Burns. Jim Burns created the finest electric guitars Britain ever produced, and he could design anything and sell nothing. And the one time he found a buyer, they understood less about guitars than he understood about money. The builder and the buyer deserved each other in the worst possible way. And between them, they ensured that when the world thinks of electric guitars, it thinks of California and Kalamazoo. Not Romford. Never Romford. Walk down Chesham Close today, and the small industrial buildings are still there, occupied by businesses that have nothing to do with music. The air doesn't smell of sycamore dust or polyester lacquer. The quiet, precise sound of copper wire being wound around Alnico magnets, 5,000 turns, one pickup at a time, is decades gone. But put on any Queen record. Any one. The first chord, the first solo, the first of those great layered harmonies that Brian May built from the Red Special and 3 Burns trisonic pickups he bought for 9 guineas in 1963. That sound is still there. It never left. Jim Burns made that. And that, at least, nobody could take away.